The hall was alive with 1,000 whispers, yet every sound seemed to pause when his footsteps entered. The Alpha King, cloaked in power that shimmered like heat from a flame, carried with him a silence that swallowed voices whole. For hours, women had stepped forward, beautiful, flawless, draped in silks and jewels, yet none had stirred the fire in his eyes. One by one, their hopes dissolved in polite rejection. The air grew restless, heavy, as though the very walls leaned closer, waiting for something extraordinary that refused to come. And then, from the edge of the crowd where shadows gathered, she rose. Her name was Aria, though most only called her the Blind Omega, the Broken Wolf. Eyes pale as spring leaves, empty of light, yet filled with an unseen depth that unsettled those who dared look too long. She should have hidden, should have accepted obscurity as her place, but tonight her spirit rebelled against silence. The drums of the ceremony beat in her chest as she stepped forward, guided only by her sister's trembling hand and the faint pulse of her wolf sense. Every movement was an act of defiance against a world that had already written her story as tragedy. The crowd gasped, some with pity, others with cruel amusement. A blind woman daring to present herself to the Alpha King? The thought itself was madness. Yet there was a grace in her bearing, a quiet strength in the way she lifted her chin, as if the darkness surrounding her was not defeat but sanctuary. In that moment, whispers ceased, replaced by the hum of possibility. Healing energy flowed in the silence she created, a strange warmth that soothed even as it unsettled, and the audience found themselves breathing slower, hearts steadying against the unexpected calm she carried with her. The Alpha King's gaze fixed upon her, sharp as a blade honed for war. He had rejected beauty, rejected ambition, rejected charm, but now something deeper stirred in him, a pull he could not name, a curiosity stronger than duty. His voice, when it came, was thunder wrapped in velvet. "You are blind." Not a question, but an unyielding truth. And yet Aria's reply, clear and steady, cut through the hall like a prayer meant to heal the soul. "Yes, Alpha King, blindness has taken my sight, but not my worth." The words lingered, sinking into every corner of the chamber, challenging centuries of prejudice with a single breath. She was no supplicant begging for pity, no trembling shadow ashamed of her brokenness. She was light hidden within darkness, daring the world to see her not for what was lost, but for what remained. The Alpha King, a man who had grown weary of facades, found himself leaning closer, drawn not by her weakness, but by the courage that shimmered in every syllable. It was then that the ceremony changed. The hall, once suffocating with disappointment, now quivered with life. The audience felt it too, that subtle, healing presence, as though her defiance stitched something forgotten back into their own hearts. Hope, fragile yet luminous. She had not been chosen yet, not even considered. But in standing tall before the impossible, she had already awakened something more enduring than desire. And beneath the weight of every eye, beneath the judgment and the disbelief, Aria sensed him, the Alpha King, fierce and lonely, watching her with a hunger that went beyond flesh. A hunger for truth, for recognition, for someone who could see through the armor of power into the quiet ache he carried within. Their souls brushed in that suspended silence, a shadow against shadows, and for the first time in years, she did not feel broken. She felt seen. The drums faded, replaced by the pounding of her own heartbeat, steady and unafraid. Around her, the whispers threatened to rise again, yet her voice silenced them all. "I do not seek your pity, nor your crown. I stand here because hiding has never healed anyone. If I must be rejected, let it be with dignity, not with shame." The Alpha King's laughter, sudden and raw, cracked the tension like a storm breaking open the sky. Not mocking, but alive. Alive in a way his people had not heard in years. In that echoing sound, destinies began to shift. The blind Omega had dared to stand, and the Alpha King, weary of empty beauty, finally felt the stirrings of something real. What began as defiance would soon become a story of recognition, of healing, of a bond deeper than sight. And as the ceremony trembled on the edge of ending, the true tale of love and destiny was only just beginning, waiting to unfold with every heartbeat that carried them closer. Like the rhythm of drums, the story pressed forward, carrying them into the unknown where shadows and light would entwine, and the path toward the Alpha King's heart opened beneath her steady steps. And for those who listen now, if you feel the warmth of Arya's courage touching your own soul, let it remind you that love often blooms where the world least expects it. If this tale brings you a moment of healing light, a breath of peace in your day, then share your heart in return. Leave a like, a comment, a small gesture of support. It is through such kindness that stories like this continue to live, continue to grow, and continue to heal. The night deepened, yet within its darkness, something radiant stirred. The Alpha King had not chosen, yet choice itself seemed to bend around this fragile yet unbroken girl who refused to remain unseen. And as he watched her, as silence stretched and the future trembled between them, the first sparks of a bond eternal were born, drawing them toward the next chapter of a love neither blindness nor power could deny. The whispers that followed her bold declaration clung to the stone walls like smoke, restless and unsure, but Arya did not waver. She stood in her simple blue dress, the pendant from her grandmother resting against her chest, the only ornament she carried into a hall filled with jewels and silks. She felt every gaze sharpen on her like arrows. Yet within the darkness that was her constant companion, she discovered a strange peace. There was healing in the silence she embraced, a warmth that flowed from the core of her spirit outward, quieting the fear that threatened to unravel her. Her sister's hand trembled against hers, but Arya steadied it with a gentle squeeze, offering comfort even as she herself faced the weight of ridicule. She had lived for years as the Pack's shadow, the blind Omega whispered about behind closed doors. Children pitied her, elders dismissed her, warriors ignored her as though she were an empty space rather than a soul with fire. And yet, as she breathed in the scent of incense and pine, as she stood before the Alpha King himself, she felt none of the shame the world had cast upon her. Instead, she felt her grandmother's words rise within her like a soft song. True sight comes from within. Those words had once been a balm when the fever stole her vision, and now they were a shield. In this chamber, surrounded by the skepticism of hundreds, Arya clung to that healing truth and discovered that courage could feel like breathing. The Alpha King stepped closer, and his presence was a tide pressing against her. The air grew heavier, warmer, filled with the raw energy of dominance. To most, it would have been overwhelming, a force that demanded submission. To Arya, it was a storm she could feel in every nerve, yet something inside her remained unbroken. The wolf sense that had grown in the absence of sight stirred within her chest, alert, attentive, alive. It whispered that this man was not only powerful, but lonely. And it was that loneliness she recognized as if it were her own reflection. For years, Arya had carried her blindness like a chain, convinced that her worth had been reduced to pity. But standing there, beneath the full weight of the Alpha King's voice and the silence of the hall, she realized that her scars had not made her small. They had made her enduring. Her heart whispered with a strange calm, a healing rhythm that steadied her trembling hands. She raised her face toward the unseen, toward the fire of his gaze that she could not meet, yet somehow felt, and she did not bow in defeat. She stood as though the ground itself had risen to hold her steady. Her sister's voice reached her ear, pleading, warning, desperate to protect her from humiliation. But Arya's resolve was iron-wrapped in tenderness. She released Nora's hand and stepped forward alone. Each footfall was a quiet rebellion against years of silence. Each step a vow that blindness had stolen her sight, but not her place in this world. The hall parted around her, the whispers now hushed with uneasy anticipation. She could hear the quickened breaths, smell the mixture of jasmine, sweat, and fear, and beneath it all, she sensed the Alpha King's focus tightening around her like the center of a storm. When she spoke her name, Arya of the Northern Lakes Pack, her voice did not tremble. It rang out as though carried on the wind itself, clear and steady, and for the first time in years she felt herself expanding into the space she occupied, no longer invisible, no longer broken. The weight of silence that followed was vast. She could feel it pressing against her skin, stretching across the chamber, testing her strength. And then came his voice, deeper than thunder yet threaded with curiosity. "You speak boldly for an Omega." Her answer flowed like water, soft yet unyielding. "Perhaps because I have had to be bold to survive." And in the moment those words escaped her lips, she felt something loosen inside her, as if chains long unseen had fallen away. The hall shifted around her, the crowd no longer certain of the ending they had imagined. Instead of pity, there was intrigue. Instead of dismissal, there was the flicker of something rare, possibility. Healing filled her chest like light through cracks in stone, a gentle reminder that even in darkness, new beginnings could be born. And then came the ripple she could not explain. The sensation of his presence drawing closer, his scent of smoke and pine wrapping around her, his heat brushing her skin as though the air itself bent toward her. Her wolf stirred, not with submission, but with recognition, a stirring that filled her with warmth instead of fear. He commanded her to look at him, though she could not. Still, she lifted her face, her blind eyes searching the darkness she had lived within for so long. In that suspended moment, she felt the impossible, a glimpse, not of form, but of essence, a shadow against shadows that pulsed with power and loneliness alike. The hall gasped when she whispered the truth only her heart could sense. "I feel your strength, your presence, your loneliness." The words, daring and unguarded, wove through the silence like a thread of healing light. It was more than defiance. It was intimacy, as if she had reached into the untouchable heart of the Alpha King and spoken aloud what no one else dared acknowledge. The reaction was instant and electric. Where others might have condemned her, he laughed. Not cruelly, but in a sound that cracked open the hall with surprise, as though for the first time in years he felt something real. That laughter, raw and sudden, changed everything. Whispers broke out again, but now they carried confusion, awe, fear of the unknown that had just entered the room. The Alpha King had not chosen her, not yet, but he had not dismissed her either. Instead, his voice carried through the hall, steady and final. The ceremony was over. Women who had waited for hours stood in shock, their hopes dissolved in a single unexpected decision. And yet Aria, the blind Omega, felt the threads of destiny coil around her, pulling her into a path no one else had seen coming. As she turned to leave with her sister, her heart still pounding with the echoes of his presence, a hand caught her shoulder. The Beta's voice was firm yet careful. The Alpha King requested her presence, alone. Fear and wonder twined together in her chest, yet even in her uncertainty, Aria felt the healing calm of courage take root. The night was far from over. This was only the beginning, and with each breath, with each step, she was walking not into darkness, but into the light of something greater, something that waited beyond fear. And so the hall faded behind her, the whispers dissolving like mist, and the path forward opened into shadowed corridors leading to the unknown. But in the steady beat of her heart and the lingering warmth of his laughter, she felt destiny stirring, an unfolding tale of love, of healing, and of the bond that would soon begin to weave itself between two souls who had both been waiting, unseen, until now. The corridors were cool and quiet, every step muffled by thick carpets that carried her deeper into a world she could not see, yet could feel pressing in around her. The Beta guided her with steady precision, his grip impersonal but careful, his silence only broken by the echo of doors closing behind them. Aria's heart beat like a drum within her chest, not from fear alone, but from the strange pull of destiny that seemed to coil tighter with every breath. Her fingers brushed the pendant at her throat, the small carved wolf worn smooth by years of touch, and she let its familiar shape anchor her. The healing presence of memory whispered strength into her veins, reminding her that even in darkness she was never entirely alone. When they reached the chamber, the Beta released her hand and placed it upon the wall. "Follow this to the chair in the center," he instructed, before leaving her with the heavy click of the closing door. The silence that followed was immense, wrapping around her like a shroud. But Aria moved with steady breaths until her hands found the promised chair. She sat upright, composed despite the tremor beneath her ribs, and waited. Time stretched thin, a thread drawn taut, until the air shifted. Without a sound, she knew he was there. His presence filled the room like a tide, and the atmosphere thickened, warmer, heavier, threaded with something primal. "You intrigued me, blind Omega." His voice came at last, deep and deliberate, each syllable a weight. "Few things intrigue me anymore." Aria turned her face toward the sound, steady though her heart raced. "I don't understand why I'm here," she admitted softly. His answer came closer, his footsteps circling her with the silence of a predator. "Call me Evander," he said, and in that simple command the distance of titles began to dissolve. You are here because you were the only one who did not flatter, did not deceive. 200 women stood before me, but only you spoke truth. The words struck her like a sudden wind, shaking her composure. She, the forgotten Omega, the broken wolf, had seen what none of them had dared to reveal. She remembered the weight of his loneliness pressing against her spirit, and the healing gentleness of her own words returned to her, reminding her that honesty, even when dangerous, could be the balm that reached places untouched by power. She drew a breath, her voice quiet but firm. That was not courage, it was necessity. When sight was taken from me, truth became the only ground I could stand on. His silence in response was not cold but contemplative, as though he weighed each word she offered. Then, slowly, he moved closer until the warmth of his body brushed the edges of her awareness. "You saw me," he whispered, not with accusation, but with something rawer, more fragile. "No one has seen me in years." She lifted her face toward him, her unseeing eyes steady. "I did not see," she confessed, her words carrying the quiet honesty of a prayer. "I only felt presence, strength, and sorrow." Evander crouched before her, his power folding into something quieter, a man revealing himself rather than a king. She could sense his gaze heavy on her, as though he willed her to pierce the darkness and find him there. His hand brushed hers, not commanding but tentative, as though asking permission to close the distance. The touch burned through her skin, not with pain, but with a healing warmth that calmed the storm within her chest. She did not withdraw. For the first time in years, Arya allowed herself to believe that perhaps her brokenness had not rendered her unworthy, but instead had carved her into someone capable of seeing beyond the surface. Their words wove a fragile intimacy between them. He asked of her blindness, of the fever that had stolen her sight, of the way she had adapted. She spoke, hesitantly at first, of the wolf sense that guided her, of the shapes and shadows she could feel beyond the grasp of human vision. As she described it, he listened not as a ruler dissecting a subject, but as a man captivated by the rare strength before him. The sincerity of his listening was its own healing force, soothing wounds long ignored by indifference. And then he spoke of her nature, not merely Omega, but true Omega, rare and powerful, carrying within her the stillness that calmed storms. His words landed heavy, for she had carried this secret buried deep, hidden by her father and healer alike, to keep her safe. Yet Evander sensed it instantly, naming what she had spent years denying. Fear pricked her skin at the danger of such revelation, but beneath it pulsed relief, as if the truth itself could finally breathe in the open air. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, steady and grounding, and though power radiated from him like fire, it was his gentleness that made her shiver. Arya's heart wavered between fear and longing. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the warmth of his presence, yet the weight of impossibility pressed on her. She was blind, an Omega, the last person the Pax would accept as queen. She whispered this truth aloud, hoping it would shatter the fragile illusion between them. But Evander's voice came firm, almost tender. "And yet, here we are. You saw me when no one else dared. That cannot be dismissed." His conviction wrapped around her like a cloak, and though reason screamed against it, her soul ached with the healing balm of being acknowledged, seen, not for her blindness, but for her essence. When his hand rose to touch her cheek, the gesture was so fleeting she wondered if it were imagined. Yet the warmth lingered long after, echoing like a promise unspoken. He told her she would remain in the palace, that the night was not an ending but a beginning. And though confusion and fear tangled within her, Arya felt something deeper than doubt. It was the first glimmer of belonging, a seed of destiny awakening in the fertile soil of loneliness shared. As the beta returned to lead her away, her thoughts spun like leaves in the wind. She had not been rejected, not dismissed, but chosen. Chosen in a way that frightened her more than rejection ever could. Her footsteps carried her into unfamiliar halls, into chambers of luxury she could not see, but could feel through silks and velvet beneath her fingertips, through the warmth of spring-fed water flowing in the bathing chambers, through the careful hands of servants who treated her not as burden, but as guest. Each touch, each kindness, became a thread of healing woven into the fabric of a life that had always been defined by limits. That night, as she lay awake in the softness of a bed too vast for one, she could not quiet the memory of his voice, the brush of his presence, the echo of his laughter. His loneliness had reached for hers, and in that connection something profound had stirred. She was still blind, still the Omega whispered about, yet she no longer felt unseen. Somewhere in the palace, the Alpha King walked its halls, and his thoughts, she knew, would find her as surely as hers reached for him. And though the night pressed heavy beyond her closed eyes, she felt the dawning of a bond stronger than sight, stronger than fear, stronger even than fate itself. Morning arrived with the soft rustle of fabric and the fragrance of flowers carried on the breeze. Arya had not slept deeply, for her mind had wandered again and again to the chamber where his presence had wrapped around her like fire. She rose when the servant entered, guided into the warmth of water heated from hidden springs beneath the palace. The feel of it against her skin soothed the restless weight of her thoughts, a healing balm that loosened the tension in her shoulders. When she dressed, the silken gown slid like water over her body, light and unfamiliar, and her hair was arranged in ways she could not see but could sense in the careful touches of practiced hands. When the servant whispered that the Alpha King himself had chosen the color to match her eyes, something within Arya tightened, both tender and aching. Eyes that saw nothing, yet had inspired him to see her differently. Wren, the beta, came to escort her into the gardens, where birdsong painted the air with music and fountains whispered with the clarity of flowing streams. Each sound was alive, and each scent rose fresh from the earth, grounding her in a place that felt older than stone walls. And then she heard him, his voice emerging from the rhythm of water and wind, calling her nearer. Evander's presence was less sharp in the garden, less the weight of a ruler, and more the quiet gravity of a man. When he guided her hand to the marble fountain, describing the wolves carved into its surface, Arya traced their forms with her fingers, and a strange warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in her life, someone was not simply leading her past beauty, but placing beauty into her hands, helping her to know it without sight. His voice lingered close, rich and steady, and she felt the healing comfort of being included in a world others assumed forever closed to her. Their conversation unfolded gently, as though the garden itself invited honesty. He confessed he still considered her as a mate, bluntly, with the directness of an alpha, but the vulnerability of a man searching for something beyond duty. Arya's heart raced, torn between disbelief and the dangerous pull of hope. She spoke of her fear that his interest was nothing more than curiosity or the rare value of her true Omega spark. But his reply carried weight. If all he wanted was advantage, there were others with perfect sight, others with bloodlines untouched by whispers. Yet it was her presence, her spirit, her ability to sense truth that bound his thoughts. She heard the sincerity in his tone, not as a king speaking of alliances, but as a man who had found a healing light in her presence. The sudden arrival of dire news shattered the moment. Raiders had attacked a border village, leaving flames and sorrow behind. Evander's voice changed instantly, commanding, resolute, the Alpha King whose decisions bore the weight of lives. Arya should have stepped aside, should have returned to the safety of her chambers, but instead she felt her healer's instincts surge. She pleaded to be taken to the wounded, offering her skills not as a queen, not as a chosen mate, but simply as one who refused to stand idle when others suffered. Though hesitation flickered in his silence, he granted her request, and Ren led her swiftly into the heart of urgency. The healing chambers smelled of herbs, blood, and smoke. Cries of pain mingled with hurried voices, and Arya moved without hesitation. Guided by her wolf sense and the years spent beside her pack's healer, she reached for herbs by scent, mixed tinctures by touch, and pressed her hands gently but firmly against wounds that bled grief as much as blood. Her voice became a balm for frightened children, her calm words weaving healing into chaos. Those who doubted her at first soon fell silent, watching the blind Omega work with precision and compassion. She became more than brokenness in that moment. She became necessity, strength, and solace. Hours passed in a blur of work, and still she did not falter. Each life touched by her hands reminded her that even in darkness she carried light. When she finally paused, exhaustion heavy in her bones, she sensed him before he spoke. Evander's voice was quieter than the day before, tinged with something deeper than authority. He told her she had impressed the healers, men who yielded praise rarely. She heard him step closer, felt his hand steady her when her knees weakened. And though her gown was stained with blood, though her hair hung loose and tangled, she felt his regard like warmth against her skin. He guided her away from the chambers, his hand careful at her elbow, and in his study the air softened. There, amidst the scent of parchment and fire, he revealed more of himself, his doubts, his grief, his fears that stretched back to the brother he had lost to the same southern threat. He spoke not as a king, but as a man who had carried loneliness like armor for too long. Arya listened, her silence a healing space where his burdens could rest. When he spoke of small joys, the archives, dawn light on the mountains, she felt the boy he once was stir beneath the hardened alpha. Her hand found his, instinctively, and his fingers closed around hers with a pressure that was firm yet gentle. The fire crackled, time stretched, and for the first time she felt the bond between them deepen beyond words. The healing she offered was not only for the wounded in the chambers, but for him, for the man who had forgotten what it meant to be seen. And when he asked her to dine with him the following evening, his tone carried no command, only a quiet hope. She said yes, her voice steadier than her racing heart. That night, As she lay in her chambers, the echo of his words and the warmth of his touch lingered. The palace had once felt foreign, filled with whispers and walls too high, but now it pulsed with something different. It held the memory of a garden where beauty was placed in her hands, the urgency of healing chambers where she had proven her strength, and the firelit study where she had been entrusted with a ruler's hidden truths. The path was no longer a corridor of fear, but an unfolding journey, carrying her forward into something she had never believed possible. Recognition, connection, love awakening in the quiet spaces between words. And as dawn stretched its light across the sky once more, Arya knew the story was only beginning. The bond between her and Evander had taken root, fragile yet undeniable, and with each passing moment it grew stronger, weaving them into a destiny neither blindness nor power could unravel. The steps she had taken from the hall to his chamber, from the healing rooms to his study, were more than chance. They were the beginning of a path that led not only to him, but to herself, whole, unbroken, and radiant in ways no darkness could diminish. The palace stirred with a rhythm of renewal as the day of their private dinner arrived. A quiet hum of servants preparing terraces and arranging dishes beneath the open sky. Arya sat still, while Mira, the young attendant who had cared for her since her arrival, brushed her hair until it shone like pale silk, and dressed her in a gown of deep blue, chosen for its contrast against her skin. Fingers traced the fine embroidery so she could imagine its elegance, and when lavender oil was dabbed upon her wrists, a calming sweetness rose into her breath, like a thread of healing that steadied her heart. The thought of dining with him, not as king and subject, but as man and woman, filled her with both wonder and trembling anticipation. Wren led her through the winding halls until the scent of night-blooming flowers drifted around her, and the air grew fresher. When the doors opened, a breeze caressed her face, carrying with it the sound of Evander's voice, low and warm. He greeted her not with formality, but with the softness of one who had waited. His hand found hers, lifting it gently to his lips, and though she could not see the gesture, she felt its reverence in the warmth that lingered. He guided her to the table prepared upon the highest terrace, where stars spread like scattered diamonds above them, and the gardens below whispered with the quiet life of night. The meal unfolded not as a ritual of state, but as something tender, intimate. Evander described each dish with care, guiding her hand to where food lay upon her plate, ensuring she tasted each flavor as though he were gifting her the world through words. Bread warm from the ovens, meats seasoned with herbs gathered from the palace gardens, fruits chilled by mountain air, all became stories in his telling, weaving texture and fragrance into the canvas of her imagination. For Arya, who had so often been left out of the world's beauty, the simple act of his descriptions was a healing kindness, a reminder that she need not be excluded when someone chose to see her fully. Their conversation deepened with the meal, flowing like water across stones, gentle yet unrelenting. She spoke of her childhood by the northern lakes, of winters that froze the world into silence, and summers that burst with fleeting splendor. He told her of battles fought at borders, of decisions that weighed like chains upon his shoulders, and of the secret joy he found in the archives hidden beneath the palace. The scholar within him, long buried beneath duty, flickered alive when he spoke of history, of texts older than memory, and Arya listened with quiet wonder, sensing how that forgotten passion shaped him even now. At times silence fell between them, yet it was not the silence of emptiness, but of presence. The stars arched overhead, the fountain below murmured like an eternal song, and in those pauses Arya felt something grow between them, gentle, steady, and healing. Her wolf sense caught the subtle shifts of his breath, the warmth of his body leaning closer, the unspoken truths resting in the space between their hands. And when his fingers brushed hers beneath the table, tentative yet deliberate, she did not pull away. Instead, she allowed their touch to linger, letting the bond strengthen in silence. When the meal ended, Evander rose and asked her to follow. His hand at her back guided her through corridors descending deep into the mountain, where the air grew cooler and the scent of stone and dust replaced the night's blossoms. A heavy door groaned open, and warmth from beeswax candles mingled with the fragrance of ancient parchment. He had brought her to the archives, the sanctuary he rarely shared. She could feel his reverence in every word as he placed her hand upon carved bindings, tracing symbols embossed into covers older than dynasties. He told her of the Omega Codex, a text thought to be myth, written by the first true Omega. His voice carried the awe of a man not speaking of power, but of destiny, of balance between alpha strength and omega healing. He read aloud passages that spoke of inner sight, of perceiving truths beyond vision. As the words flowed, Arya felt a strange resonance in her chest, as though the book described the very essence of what she had lived all these years. She remembered moments when she had sensed pain unspoken, when she had felt presence where none should have been, when she had spoken truths no one else dared name. Her blindness had never been only loss. It had been a path to another kind of sight. And in the echo of his voice reading sacred words, she felt not broken but whole. Healing radiated through her, gentle yet unstoppable, like a river long dammed suddenly flowing free. Evander guided her through simple exercises, asking her to sense objects without touch, to describe emotions he hid behind silence. To her surprise, she succeeded again and again, not perfectly, but with growing certainty. His delight was palpable, each word of praise laced with wonder. He was not studying her as a specimen, but celebrating her as a revelation. And in that celebration she felt her heart open wider than it had in years. Exhaustion threatened to overtake her, yet exhilaration burned bright. She laughed softly at one success, and his answering laughter was low, rich, and filled with something she had not expected, joy. The air between them shifted then, charged with unspoken longing. He leaned close, his breath warm against her cheek, his voice a whisper that trembled with restraint. When he asked for permission, she nodded, and his lips found hers with a tenderness that unravelled every defence she had built. The kiss was not command, but invitation, not dominance, but discovery. It deepened, and in its heat she felt the healing of years of isolation, the breaking of chains forged by pity and silence. For the first time since darkness had claimed her sight, Arya felt illuminated from within. When he drew back, his words were roughened by emotion. He spoke of wanting her not for advantage, not for rarity, but for the way she made him remember who he was beneath the crown. He offered her his truth, his protection, his loyalty until death, words ancient and binding in their weight. Overwhelmed, Arya pressed her palm against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and the response rose from her like breath itself. She pledged her healing, her perception, her loyalty until death, and the bond sealed between them like fire and water meeting, fierce yet soothing, unbreakable. In that moment she was no longer the blind Omega whispered about in pity. She was Arya, true Omega, chosen mate of the Alpha King, her spirit woven with his in a union that promised not only love, but the healing of a fractured kingdom. As his arms wrapped around her, holding her close in the quiet sanctity of the archives, she felt destiny settle like a mantle upon her shoulders. No longer unseen, no longer diminished, she had found her place, not beside him as shadow, but as equal, as mate, as queen. And the night, rich with the whispers of ancestors etched into ancient parchment, carried them into a future that neither darkness nor doubt could unravel. The dawn after the archives carried with it a stillness unlike any Arya had known. Her body should have been weary from hours spent in a place so heavy with history. Her mind should have been restless with fear at the vow she had spoken. Yet she awoke with a calm that felt like healing rain falling over scorched earth. The silence of her chamber was warm, alive with memory. The press of his lips, the strength of his heartbeat beneath her palm, the way his voice had trembled when he called her mate. Even the darkness behind her eyes seemed softer, threaded with the golden warmth of recognition. For the first time in years, she was not waiting for rejection. She was no longer defined by absence. She was claimed, whole, and seen. The day unfolded with urgency. Word spread quickly through the palace that Arya had been chosen, not by official decree, but by the quiet certainty in the way the Alpha King now carried himself. The healers whispered of her skill, the servants of her gentleness, the guards of her courage. Rumors stirred like restless leaves, some awed, some doubtful, some tinged with fear. But Arya did not let the noise of others disturb the healing rhythm she had begun to weave within herself. Instead, she returned to the healing chambers, her hands steady as she worked beside Master Thorn. Each wound she dressed became an affirmation. Each frightened child she soothed a reminder that her worth had always been more than what eyes could see. When Evander visited, he did not interrupt. He stood at a distance, silent, watching. She sensed him like fire at her back, steady and unyielding, but also like the first sunlight on winter ice, melting walls too long frozen. He let her finish before stepping forward, his hand brushing lightly against her arm as he praised her in front of those who once doubted. The respect that rippled through the chamber was not only for her, but for what they represented together. Alpha strength, tempered by Omega healing. That evening he led her once more into the heart of the palace, but this time not to the archives. He brought her to a private garden hidden within the walls, where the air was sweet with jasmine and the earth breathed with quiet life. He told her this place had belonged to his mother, a queen who had died when he was still young, and no one but he had walked its paths since. As he guided her hands along the petals of roses and the bark of old trees, she felt the intimacy of his gift. He was not showing her power, not offering luxury, but opening a wound long kept hidden, trusting her to heal it with presence alone. Beneath the starlight, he spoke of burdens, of councils divided, of raids growing bolder, of the fear that unity among the packs would fracture. His voice hardened as he described the threats, then softened when he admitted his own doubts. Arya listened, her silence weaving space for him to breathe. When she finally spoke, her words were not commands nor counsel, but truth that rose from her wolf sense, that he was not alone anymore, that his strength was no longer his burden to carry alone. The healing in her tone settled into him like a balm, and for the first time since his brother's death, Evander allowed himself to lean into someone else's steadiness. The nights that followed grew into a rhythm of discovery. They dined together beneath stars, walked gardens where she learned the world through touch guided by his hands, and lingered in libraries where his voice carried the weight of old words into her imagination. Their bond deepened not through spectacle, but through constancy, through the way he never let her feel less for what she could not see, and the way she reminded him he was more than the crown he wore. Each glance, each brush of fingers, each breath shared in silence was its own vow. And yet shadows stirred beyond the palace walls. News of southern wolves taking captives spread, whispers of betrayal among neighboring packs crept through the halls. Evander's council pressed him with demands for war, their voices sharp with fear and pride. Arya heard the tension in their words when she passed the council chambers, heard the unease in the footsteps of guards doubling their patrols. Danger loomed closer, like a storm rolling unseen but inevitable. She could not see it, but she felt it pressing against the edges of her wolf sense. The air itself vibrated with unrest. Evander confided in her then, more openly than he had with any counselor. He spoke of the raids, of the uncertainty, of the desperation for answers that scouts and spies could not bring. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of a man torn between war and restraint. And Arya, listening, felt again the stirrings of her strange sight, the ability to sense what others missed. It was as though the bond they had sealed had sharpened her gift, turning her blindness into something more luminous. She began to catch fragments in her awareness, whispers of lies in voices too smooth, flickers of deceit cloaked in courtesy, shadows of fear hidden behind bravado. It was Evander who placed the idea before her, that perhaps her sight, born not of eyes but of soul, could guide them to truths no scout could uncover, that her gift could help protect not only the palace but the people who looked to him for safety. At first she resisted, afraid of being used as a weapon, of losing herself to a role too heavy for her spirit. But he reassured her, his voice low and steady, telling her he did not want her as tool, but as partner, as equal. His hand enfolded hers as he whispered that together they could face what came, not as king and subject, but as Alpha and Omega, as man and mate. The choice stretched before her like a path into uncharted forests. To step into it meant danger, meant exposure, meant placing her trust not only in him but in herself. And yet, in the healing warmth of his presence, in the certainty of his heartbeat steady beneath her palm, Arya felt the fear soften. She had been blind for years, and still she had walked forward. Perhaps now her darkness was not limitation but guidance, a lantern invisible to others but luminous within her soul. And so, as another dawn painted pale light across the palace walls, Arya stood beside Evander on a balcony overlooking the lands that stretched into shadow. She felt the weight of history in the stone beneath her feet, the weight of destiny in the bond between their hands. War threatened, whispers sharpened, but within the warmth of their closeness she felt a truth unshakable. Together they could transform not only their own lives, but the fate of every pack bound to their rule. The healing that flowed between them was not hers alone, nor his alone, but the weaving of two spirits into something greater, a force that promised to endure even as storms gathered. And when the wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and smoke, she lifted her face toward it. Unseeing eyes turned to the horizon and whispered the vow that would guide her steps forward, not to hide, not to diminish, but to walk into the unknown with the Alpha King at her side. The path beyond was uncertain, but in its uncertainty lay the promise of love, of healing, and of a future neither darkness nor war could tear apart. The days that followed became a quiet tapestry of intimacy and discovery, woven with threads of duty and tenderness. Arya moved through the palace as though she had always belonged, her steps guided by memory and wolf sense, her presence met with curiosity that slowly softened into respect. Where once whispers had carried pity, they now carried awe. The blind Omega who had stood unflinching before the Alpha King had become more than rumor. She was now a presence no one could ignore. Evander watched this transformation with silent pride, though he rarely said as much aloud. His eyes, sharp with the weight of command, softened whenever they rested upon her. He observed her in the healing chambers where she worked beside Master Thorn, her voice steadying trembling hands, her touch drawing courage from the wounded. He lingered in the shadows of corridors as she navigated unfamiliar halls with grace, listening to her laughter with servants, her patience with children who reached for her hand without hesitation. She was not queen yet, not by formal ceremony, but in the hearts of many she had already begun to heal the fractures left by years of fear and distrust. Their evenings belonged to one another. Sometimes they dined beneath the stars, his voice describing the constellations while she traced his words into memory. Other times they walked the hidden garden where her fingers learned the language of roses, of ivy curling against stone, of the smooth bark of trees that had stood longer than any crown. In those quiet moments, Evander shed the armor of kingship, and Arya met the man within, the scholar who still cherished ancient texts, the brother who still carried grief like a scar, the man whose loneliness had been seen and soothed by her courage. Yet the world beyond their closeness pressed harder. Southern wolves moved like shadows along the borders, and each council session ended in argument. Voices demanded war, others urged caution, but few offered unity. Arya felt the tension vibrate through the palace like a string drawn too tight, ready to snap. When Evander returned from council, his silence was heavy, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of expectation. She did not pry with words. Instead, she offered him space where his burdens could rest. Her hands would find his, grounding him. Her voice would offer healing truths. That strength was not only in command, but in the courage to seek balance, that his people needed more than victory. They needed hope. One night, when the moon hung low and the world outside slept, he brought her again to the archives. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with longing, as he read passages from the Omega Codex, texts that spoke of bonds unbreakable, of pairs who carried both fire and healing into the heart of chaos. He paused often, watching her face, and though she could not see him, Arya felt his gaze like warmth across her skin. She listened, not only to his words, but to the way his heart beat when silence stretched between them. That night, when he kissed her again, it was no longer discovery. It was confirmation. The bond between them had settled into something unshakable, something as inevitable as dawn. Still, Doubt lingered at the edges of her heart. She knew the whispers that circled in shadowed halls. A blind queen would never be accepted. True Omegas were treasures, but also threats, targets for those who saw them as tools. The danger of being at his side was immense, not only for her, but for those she loved. Yet when she voiced her fears, Evander silenced them not with denial, but with devotion. He told her that love was not measured by safety, but by truth. And the truth was that his soul had recognized hers long before either had spoken the words aloud. His vow to protect her was not duty, but desire, as fierce as the bond that pulled them together. The test of that bond came with the rising storm. Survivors from another raid arrived at the palace gates, carrying not only wounds, but stories of betrayal. Southern wolves working with human traders, whole families taken in the night. The council erupted in fury, demanding retaliation. Evander prepared for war, his voice hard and commanding. But when night fell, he sought Arya's counsel. Not as queen, not yet, but as the woman whose inner sight had already pierced through shadows where others saw nothing. Together they stood on the balcony, the wind carrying scents of smoke and pine. Arya closed her eyes, not in weakness but in strength, and reached with her wolf sense into the spaces beyond. She felt the echoes of fear still clinging to the survivors, the threads of truth woven in their trembling voices, the pulse of deception from one counselor whose words had rung too smoothly earlier in the day. She whispered what she felt, and Evander listened, not questioning her gift, but trusting it. That trust itself was a healing balm, soothing her lingering doubts about her place by his side. Their bond grew not in declarations, but in the way they moved together. His strength anchoring her when the world trembled, her healing presence tempering the fire of his command. Nights of passion deepened their closeness, their bodies learning the language of love as naturally as their souls had done. But even in the gentlest moments, there was always the undercurrent of destiny. Each embrace, each whispered word, carried the weight of something larger than themselves, as though the ancestors themselves watched and waited for what they would become. As the council prepared for decisions that could ignite war, Arya stood beside Evander in silence, her presence a steady flame. She was no longer the girl who had walked into the mating ceremony seeking only dignity in rejection. She was no longer the broken wolf. In the reflection of his strength and the embrace of his trust, she had found her wholeness. And in her healing, he had found the balance that kingship alone had stolen from him. When dawn came again, gilding the mountains with light, Evander turned to her, his hand closing around hers, and whispered words that would bind not only them, but the fate of every pack. The ceremony to declare her queen would be held soon, before council, before the people, before the world. It would be a risk, a defiance of expectation, but it would also be the fulfillment of what had already been written in the beating of their hearts. Arya, listening, felt no fear, only the steady rhythm of truth, the healing certainty of love, and the quiet strength of destiny moving through them both. And as the wind carried the sound of distant wolves across the mountains, she lifted her face to the sky, her unseeing eyes turned toward the horizon, and smiled. The path ahead was perilous, but love had already lit it, and where love walked, healing followed, carrying them forward into the chapter that waited beyond. The day of revelation dawned with skies veiled in silver, the mountains standing like ancient witnesses to what was about to unfold. The palace thrummed with whispers, the kind that slid through corridors and curled around corners, carrying fear, hope, and disbelief in equal measure. Servants rushed with preparations, counselors sharpened their words into weapons, and warriors stood ready for the command of their alpha king. But within her chamber, Arya sat in silence, her hands folded around the carved wolf pendant that had once been her only shield. She breathed deeply, letting healing calm spread through her body, reminding herself that today was not a reckoning of what she had lost, but a proclamation of who she had become. When Evander entered, his steps were firm, his presence filling the chamber like fire in winter. Yet the weight of the king was softened by the warmth of the man who now stood before her. He knelt at her side, lifting her hand to his lips, and in that single gesture she felt the truth of his vow repeated without words. He did not see her as fragile, nor as broken, but as the one who balanced his power, the one who had healed the silence of his loneliness. His voice was low, steady, and filled with tenderness as he asked her once more if she was ready to walk beside him, not in shadow, but in light. Her answer was simple, her voice clear and unwavering. Yes. Together they stepped into the great hall where the council waited. The air was thick with judgment, with the sharp scent of doubt. Murmurs rippled through the assembly as eyes turned toward her, some incredulous, some hostile, others softened by the memory of her healing hands in the chambers of the wounded. Evander's grip on her hand tightened, not to guide her, but to anchor her, to remind all who watched that she was his choice. His voice rose, commanding silence, and the echo of it trembled through stone and bone alike. He spoke of strength, of unity, of the need for balance in a time when war threatened to consume them all. And then, with the authority of crown and the honesty of his heart, he declared Arya his mate, his equal, his queen. The chamber erupted. Some shouted in outrage, others in wonder. Yet, amid the storm of voices, Arya felt no fear. She lifted her chin, her blind eyes turned toward the sound of their disbelief, and spoke with a clarity that silenced the hall. She told them she was blind, yes, but blindness had not stripped her of worth. She told them of healing the wounded, of sensing truths that eyes could not see, of standing where others had faltered because she had nothing left to lose but her dignity. And finally, she told them of the loneliness she had felt within herself, a loneliness that mirrored the king's, and how in finding each other they had found something stronger than power, balance, wholeness, and love. Her words fell like water on parched soil. The crowd stilled, their doubts held at bay by the quiet power that radiated from her. For in that moment, she was not a blind omega begging for recognition. She was the voice of healing, the embodiment of resilience, and the living proof that strength took many forms. Evander stood beside her, his hand resting proudly over hers, his gaze a shield of fire. He did not need to command their acceptance. She had earned it herself. The ceremony concluded not with the roar of victory, but with the quiet shift of hearts. Some remained hardened, unwilling to bend. Yet many looked upon her with new eyes, recognizing in her the courage they longed for within themselves. And when Evander led her from the hall, it was not as a woman escorted by a king, but as a queen walking beside her mate, equal in every step. That night, Beneath the stars on the palace terrace, they stood together in silence. The world beyond the mountains waited with its threats and wars, but here, in this moment, they were only two souls bound by a love that had healed what years of loss had broken. Evander drew her into his arms, his lips brushing her hair, and she leaned against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. The bond between them pulsed like an eternal flame, steady and unbreakable. Arya knew their journey had only begun. Challenges lay ahead, shadows darker than any they had yet faced, but the truth was undeniable. Together they were stronger. Together they would heal not only themselves, but the kingdom that looked to them for hope. The blind Omega was blind no longer, for she had found sight within love, and the Alpha King was no longer alone, for he had found his equal. And for those who listen to their story now, let it remind you that love is not perfection, but recognition, not ease, but courage, not safety, but truth. If this tale has touched you, if Arya's healing journey has stirred something within your heart, I invite you to share your voice. Leave a comment. Let your thoughts be known, so this story may live not only in words, but in the hearts of many. Like this tale, if it brought warmth to your spirit, subscribe if you wish to walk with us into the chapters yet to come. For love is a journey best shared, and every gesture of support becomes another thread in the fabric of stories that heal and endure.